The importance of story. There are several different ways someone could teach the New Testament, right? We could teach the books of the Bible in the order that they were written, so their chronological development. So if this were the case, then Mark would most likely be our first book in the New Testament, right? And Revelation would be more or less at the end. It's a little bit difficult to know if John's Gospel would go back there, as well as John's letters or John's Revelation. All of those are viewed as kind of the last or the latest books of the New Testament to be written. So you can easily see if you were to take your 27 books of the New Testament, kind of shuffle them together according to chronology, it would look like a much different canon than what you have right now. I'm going to be teaching through them canonically. In other words, I'm going to start with Matthew, then Mark, and Luke, and John. And we're going to work through them very much according to the table of contents in your Bible. And the reason that I'm doing that is because primarily I'm focused on the storyline of Scripture. So like I said, there's multiple different really profitable ways to study the New Testament. I want you to understand the New Testament as the completion and fulfillment of the Old Testament narrative. So the Old Testament starts with this wonderful story of God creating and putting humanity in His kingdom of blessing. And of course, it all goes really south really quick. And then God implements this plan to bring things back online. And the rest of the Old Testament is Him laying out this plan. And it ends with these expectations that are not met, but we're looking for them. It's kind of this cliffhanger. And then there's the New Testament. We start with Jesus. And of course, He ends up being the one who ties it all together. And then, of course, the remainder of the New Testament is about what that work accomplished in the world through you and I. So what we want to do is think in terms of story. And the nice thing about this is you and I already think in terms of story. I personally think that God has created human beings to think in terms of story. When my kids were in middle school or high school and they'd come home, I'd say, hey, how was your day? I never got a bullet point of events. It wasn't like 9 a.m. went to algebra, 8:15 went to language arts, 12 had lunch, 12:30 slept on fruit cocktail. It wasn't anything like that. It was a story. Hey, I had a good day in this class. I didn't really enjoy that one. Or, boy, here's an interesting thing that happened at lunch. It was always in terms of beginning, middle, and end. I think it's because we're hardwired to process data and to think in terms of story. So it would make sense that we understand God as being the one who is relating to us by a story. So what I've done here is I've followed some other authors in breaking down the biblical story into 6 acts. So don't think about the book of Acts. That's not what I'm talking about. Think about a stage play, right, where you go and sit down and the curtain comes up, and that's Act 1. You get your introduction to your characters, and the plot more or less begins, and curtains close, and there's Act 2, and things change. And that's what I want you to be thinking of the biblical story as. So we'll talk about the Old Testament story in relation to the first 3 acts, and then we'll talk about the New Testament story in relation to the last 3 acts here in just a second. So what is the goal of stories? Well, stories structure our daily life, and they make sense out of the many moments in life. You may not realize it, but you actually interpret the events in your life by the story that's already gone before you, your story, and then where you think your story is heading. So, for example, if you hope the story of your life is going to end with you being very rich, like you're kind of like, man, the end of this story, I can see it. I'm going to be rolling in cash. Scrooge McDuck just deep diving into piles of gold. And then all of a sudden, a moment in your life, someone gifts you $1 million, you're going to be like, wow, that is a good thing. That's leading me to this conclusion that I had always hoped for. So this is a good part of the story. However, if you get mugged, in Cedarville somehow, I guess that could happen. But anyway, you get mugged, you're going to be like, wow, this isn't a good thing. This is like taking away from my ultimate conclusion that I had. So you tend to evaluate and think of things in your life according to story. Stories provide also the context for our decision making. And this is one of those things that is, once you point it out, you can't unsee it. I think it's going to just strike you as obvious once I give you some illustrations here. But I would argue that unless you know the story that you're in, You can't even know whether you're making wise decisions or foolish decisions, morally good decisions versus morally evil decisions. So stories provide the context for our decision making. Let me give you an illustration. Let's pretend that all of a sudden you are transported from this class and you find yourself in the midst of this abandoned warehouse, completely abandoned of people. You kind of happen to look to the left or my right-hand side here, and you see there's a stairwell going up to a second story. You look behind you, and there's these two big double doors that are open leading out to this green pasture with a little hillock over there. It looks very peaceful. And in front of you is this table, and there is a bomb with a timer. Now, you're not trained in bomb removal or anything, but you know that that's a bomb because you've watched 24 and Jack Bauer and all that kind of stuff. So you're just up on that. Now, what do? It's clinking down. 30 seconds, 29, 28, 27. What is a reasonable decision to make in the midst of that situation? Someone help me out. Run. Who said that? There we go. Great. What's your name? Andrew. Excellent decision. I think we're all with you, Andrew. We're just going to run, right? So logically, you find this door, you run out, you climb the little hillock, and you look, and sure enough, the bomb goes off 27 seconds later, and the whole building explodes. And immediately after that, you're kind of pleased with yourself. You're like, whew, dodged that bullet. Your phone rings, and it's your boss. Come to find out, you work for the CIA. And you were tasked with removing that bomb and disarming it. And now that you haven't, all the people on the second floor are in a lot of pain because of your inactivity. In fact, your boss says, because there's this mastermind who is trying to blow up abandoned warehouses around the world, he hopes that he'll conquer the world by doing that. It's a very convoluted plan, just trust me. That now you've allowed him to get his foot in the door, and wow, he's probably going to succeed. You need to come home and face retirement. You guys know what retirement is in the spy world? It's very dark, right? Execution, right? So you come home and you're dead. All right, so let's reset. You've made a bad decision. Andrew, we're all with you, but we've all, as a group, made a bad decision. All right, let's reset the table with same warehouse, same stairwell, same exit, same table, same bomb. What's another option that you could do here? Yes, what's your name? Jaden, okay.
You pick up the bomb and carry it outside and get it away from you.
Okay, gotcha. So physically take the bomb out of the building and try to dispose of it by throwing it, and then I presume run, right? Yeah, okay, gotcha. That's not a bad idea as well. So let's say that you take the bomb out of the building. You've only got 20 seconds. Time is pretty tight. There's a good chance that you might die. There's a good chance the building might still go up. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that you're a miracle person. You're able to get this done. You run to the top of the hill. The bomb's exploded safely off in this field. Your phone rings again. You pick it up. And now, on the other end of the phone, is the evil mastermind who's trying to take over the world through destroying empty warehouses. Come to find out you're in his employ. You work for him. And you've just ruined his plan because now this abandoned warehouse that was supposed to be blown up is not. Once again, you're fired and he wants you to come back to home base so that you can face retirement. Now, in the evil mastermind business, right, retirement is very easy to understand, right? So once again, you made a bad decision. But what other options are there, right? How would you know what is the right decision to make in that story? Doesn't it depend on what story you're telling? And doesn't it depend on what your identity is in that story? In other words, if you're the CIA operative who's supposed to be saving the world, that's a different set of decisions that you need to make from if you're a henchman of the evil mastermind. Is everybody with me? Everybody tracking on how story determines what is right or wrong? Story determines whether you know whether you did a good job or not. If you don't know the story you're living in, how can you evaluate the decisions that you make to know, I'm living a good life. I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. I'm actually doing the things, of course, from our perspective, that God desires. Well, you don't, if you don't know the story. So stories provide the context for our decision making. Now, let me just tack on this one as well. It's very related to letter B, but I do want to be redundant here. Stories provide the background information for determining good and evil. So in the Garden of Eden is where we get our first taste of this right there in a good context. God tells them what to do and what not to do, and of course they choose the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which in one sense means that they're not trusting God to tell them what is good and evil. They want to be able to make that decision on their own and be their own determiners of right and wrong. And by the way, the rest of the scripture is really a retelling of that story over and over again. I mean, if you really want to look at it, the book of Judges, which you've all gone through, is just one sad story after another where everyone does what? What is right in their own eyes, right? So they are looking at the fruit and they're saying, hey, this looks delicious. I think I'll take it because that's what's good in their own eyes. Big letter D, our stories are often proven to be erroneous. The stories that you and I tell ourselves in our head, they often are mistaken. I find that I'm really creative with narrative, like when someone's done something against me. You know, you can imagine the old middle school situation where they're picking teams for kickball and you're last again. It's easy to tell yourself the story, well, they're doing this because they don't like me, you know. Or how about this? This is more common. You're walking across the bridge, you're going to the chapel building, and you're like, hey, how's it going, so-and-so? And they just completely ignore you. And you're like, oh, that's it, man. That person was ice cold. I'm never talking to them again. How dare they? You know, you create this narrative. I thought they were friends. And then you talk to the person later, and they're like, oh, yeah, I was just really thinking about something that day. You see you. We create stories in our head that are often just completely false. And so communication often helps to prevent that. But we need to recognize that the stories that we're telling ourselves, they often have a lot of error in them. And this is why we need the scriptural story to really reprogram our thinking so that we're thinking truth. Big letter E, God's word is his explanation or story for what actually exists, for what the real world is. It's also God's explanation of how we're supposed to know what is real. It's also God's explanation for how we're supposed to determine good from evil. And I believe it also draws attention to the fact that you have real moral responsibility that impacts the world around you and God's plans. This is what I mean by this last bit. Our decisions affect how the story ends. Now, not big picture. We know how the story ends. We can read Revelation. But God has invited you and I to be a part of this story because he desires to use you to share those responsibilities with you so that you can be a part of what he's doing. And this is a wonderful opportunity for you and I as human beings. So not only does God love us so much that he's provided salvation for us, but he loves us so much that he's saved us so that we can work underneath his kingship and bring about what he desires. This is where life is. This is where our devotion to Christ, King Jesus, comes to a focal point. Well, there's a second story that I want to talk to you about as well. And that is that your life is a story. In other words, you yourself, if you were to write a biography, you have a beginning, you were born, and you have an end. There's going to be a day that you die, right? And this is, there's the middle part where there's the narrative of what's going on in your life. And so you can view your own life as a story. Now, you are at an incredible junction point right now. In other words, as we talk about God's story in New Testament literature, your story is continuing to progress. And guess what? They are coming right into intersection with each other. And so you have a choice. Every day you come to New Testament literature class, it's going to be, hey, am I going to continue to just move my story forward the way I think I should? Or am I going to kind of make a turn here and join God's story and be a part of what he's doing in the real world? This is a choice that you have every time you hear chapel, a sermon, a Bible class, you do your own devotional reading, you do your homework for this class. These are all the opportunities that God is wooing you and saying, hey, I want you to join my cause. I want you to be a part of what I'm doing in the world here. Change your thinking. Sometimes we call this conviction of sin, because it means that, oh, wow, I've got to really recognize that what I'm doing here is wrong and align myself with God. Sometimes it's a matter of learning new things. We're like, well, I didn't even know I was supposed to be doing that. I didn't know I was supposed to be living that way. This is revolutionary. This is actually really helpful. Sometimes it's the way of learning not what we're supposed to be doing, but how we're supposed to be doing it by the Spirit. We learn what that means, and we realize, wow, God has got real wisdom. He's given real provision. You can enjoy life right now because it's been given to you in Christ. So these two intersect here. And in a similar way, this is like role-playing in some ways, except for it's completely flipped. It's like role-playing, but it's flipped. And I'll unpack that in a minute. So our story intersects God's story, and God invites us to abandon any false story which we contrive and to submit ourselves to His story. He invites us to take part in His story and His work. Don't minimize this. This is a wonderful opportunity to continue to meditate and chew on as you leave class today. Sometimes we think of it as, what is God's will for my life? That's a great question, but I think that's a bit too small of a question. I think it's really about, hey, what is God doing, and how can I be a part of this, right? They're related questions, but we need to understand that God is wooing us to be a part of what He's doing. It's His story, His work. So therefore, I'm going to make a conclusion statement here. Please do not quote just the first part of this. I love my job. I don't want to be misrepresented out there, right? Therefore, do not apply the Bible to your life. There's a semicolon there. Keep reading. Apply your life to the Bible. What I mean by that is if you're going to use the biblical text as just kind of a vending machine that gives you a little encouragement every now and then, that's not what I'm talking about. We don't apply the Bible piecemeal. Instead, we recognize that there's this overarching biblical narrative, and I apply my life to the story. I give myself wholeheartedly to the story. I mean, imagine if you all of a sudden became a character in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Let's just say it's, you appear somehow weirdly in the Two Towers, that novel, right? The middle book of the three. Are you going to join yourself with the parts of the fellowship and try to achieve the end of destroying the ring? Or are you just going to go get a job and see how it all works out in the end? I want to be a part of the story. I want to be where the action is. I want to be participating in this plot moving forward. I don't want to be a bystander. So this is kind of like live action role playing, right? You don't have to admit to whether you've done this or not. Live action role playing, LARPing. When people LARP, from what I've been told, they dress up and they take on a fictional persona, and then they go out and enact a story for fantasy reasons, right? To get away from things, and it's fun. To let your imagination roll, to have a purpose, to be with teammates and kind of achieve the mission or whatever it is. But I really don't think that any of these people, as they're out there on mission, right? I don't think any of them said, hey, wait a minute, I just want to interrupt our story for a second. I'm an accountant on Monday. How is this going to affect me in my life? Is it going to help me with my marriage? Am I going to be a better accountant because of this? I just don't think anybody's ever asked that. In fact, they want to get away from some of those things so that they can take on this persona. I think sometimes when we come to the Bible with those kind of questions, hey, I'm such and such, and how's this going to help me with my marriage or my kids or my future life, my job, all that? We're not asking wrong questions, but the bigger important part is where we're fitting into the story, and then we find that we have wisdom to address all those other things. So I'm no way saying that the biblical story is fictional, nor am I saying that we pretend. This is why I said it's flipped a little bit. I think when we jump into God's story, we're jumping into the real world. In other words, the illusion of what the different belief systems that we're constantly bombarded with, that we know many of them are false, some of them we've bought into without even critically thinking about it. Those are the false stories. And as we understand God's story, we're able to identify them and say, wait a minute, that's not true. This is true, and I'm going to move forward this way. All right, so let's look at this 6 acts of the biblical story. So if we want to apply our lives to the Bible, Well, we need to know the biblical story. So I didn't have you all for Old Testament literature. I don't think I've taught that for a couple of semesters now. But when I teach Old Testament literature, what I do is I teach it the same way I'm going to be teaching New Testament literature for the most part. We started with Act 1, creation, and then went Act 2, the fall, Act 3, Israel, redemption. And then there is this interlude, which is where we're going to pick up in this class. In other words, what happens after the Old Testament ends and before the New Testament begins? You may have noticed a couple things that are different. For example, when you read Matthew, you've got Romans. Like, where did they come from? Where did the Roman soldiers come from? Who are these Sadducees and Pharisees? They're not in the Old Testament. How did they get here? Everybody's kind of back in the land of Israel. That's not really how the Old Testament ends. I mean, there's some that come back, and they're not really doing all that well. So this interlude period helps to bridge the gap between what's going on in the story of the Old Testament and the story of the New Testament. So what we're going to do here is review this story. We won't get through all of it today, but we'll begin it. So let's go to the next segment of your notes, the biblical story in 6 acts. I just want to review some of the highlights of the Old Testament. No matter which professor you had, I think you'll find some continuity here that we can all agree on and remember. So what is Act 1? Well, Act 1, think of terms of a stage play. Once again, you're in the audience, curtains opens up. Act 1, it's called creation, right? I've got the title at the end. There we go. God establishes his kingdom. This is the first 2 chapters of Genesis. What happens in this? Well, we're introduced to our main character of the Bible, God. God is the main character of the Bible. Not you or I. That helps orient us right away to reading the Bible well. This is a book that is talking to me about God. Now, it is talking to me about human beings and about animals and other things, but it's really about how God is relating with all of these other pieces of his creation, if I can say it that way. So what do I learn right away? I learned that God is the God who's over all gods. He is the one who created heaven and earth. He's the one who organized the days and created function like seasons and time, crops to grow. Adam and Eve placed them in the garden. He gave them a function. All of this is not just Israel's God. It's the God who is above all gods. There is no other God besides Yahweh. We also learn that God's kingdom is a kingdom of blessing. How is the Garden of Eden described? As this place of bounty, of all their needs are being met. Food is right there for them. They do work the garden, and they do serve the garden, like serve in the garden, right? We're told this in chapter 2 of Genesis. So they have a task to do. They are also made in the image of God, which Genesis 1 clearly defines for us as exercising dominion over the created order. So they're given this task as like delegates. In other words, the king, God, is saying, I'm going to crown Adam and Eve as sub-kings, and I want them to exercise rule and dominion. I want them to organize things. I want them to continue to take the Garden of Eden and maybe spread it out, make it bigger, right? Cover the whole world. Unfortunately, we know how that goes. But another one of the benefits here is that in this kingdom, this garden sanctuary, God is with his people. So the greatest benefit of the Garden of Eden is not that they got to eat as many apples as they wanted, right? Is that God's presence was with them constantly, walking. They had access to the very presence of God. Now, I know you remember from the Old Testament class, Mount Sinai, Moses goes up into the cloud. It's full of fire and smoke, and there's terror. The people hear the voice of Yahweh talking to them, and they're afraid. They're like, Moses, you go mediate for us because we're undone here. Whenever God's presence is there, it's terrifying. You cannot enter into God's presence if you are not like God, if you're not holy, right? And so here we have in the first couple chapters, human beings are allowed to be in God's presence because there's no sin. And then, of course, they lose that when they leave the garden. And so when we look at the rest of the Old Testament, we see that, wow, God desires his presence to be with his people. And so what does he do? He teaches them to build a tabernacle, and then he comes and dwells with them. He has them build a temple, and then he comes and dwells with them. And then, right before they go into exile, you'll remember what happens. What does Ezekiel tell us? God's presence fled the temple. Remember on that that chariot throne where it's got these wheels with wheels and they're full of eyeballs, and that's God's presence on his mobile chariot zipping around like lightning. And he leaves the temple. So God's presence is one of these benefits that God desired to have with his people. Right? This is the way things were supposed to be. You and I walking with God in the Garden of Eden, enjoying the benefits of his kingdom. This is the real world that God set up. What you and I live in now is a fractured picture of that, right? We need to understand that. You've never known anything better than what you have now. But the biblical story is telling you that's not the way it began. This is the way it began. God on his throne, exercising function and dominion, delegating tasks in a realm of bounty and his presence. In other words, real life was there. So humanity is placed as a vice-regent. All I mean by that is a sub-king, if you want to view it that way. And they were to keep the garden of blessing. They were to maintain it. They were to work in the garden. Act 2, rebellion in the kingdom. So this is Genesis 3 through 11. Rebellion in the kingdom. Humans rebel against God. Of course, we know that Adam and Eve were given the command not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they did. How were they led into that decision? Well, the serpent comes in, and he tells them a different story than what God's been telling them. It's kind of important for the way I'm organizing the class that you pick up on that. So God's story so far has been, hey, I'm God, and I'm good, and I care enough for you that I'm providing you with all of this abundance, and I'm going to be with you, and we're going to be in fellowship, and I've given you a job to do, and this is a wonderful life. I've given you life. And the serpent comes in, and he says, look, that story that you've been believing, it's actually not true. God is not as good as you think he is, because he knows if you take of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will be like him, and he doesn't want that. So he's actually he's pushing you down. He's keeping you down. You too can make decisions about right and wrong by disobeying him. And then you become, instead of a sub-king, right, a vice-regent, you'll become the king. You get to make your own decisions. So, of course, Adam and Eve choose to believe the serpent's story, and they disobey God. God judges humanity, kicks them out of the garden, away from his presence. Of course, there's other consequences of that. We see Cain and Abel, and Cain kills his brother Abel. We see the flood. The world continues to become more and more violent and anti-God as they determine their own story, really, as they determine right and wrong. And as they determine right or wrong, it always leads to immorality and bloodshed, violence. And God finally says, look, judgment's going to come on them. And so he floods the world, spares Noah and his family, gives them a similar mandate to what he gave to Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply, right? They go out. And then ultimately we've got the Tower of Babel, where we see here that people are once again, instead of obeying God, they're disobeying God. They're determining their own right and wrong. And then thankfully, in the midst of all that, God offers mercy through his choosing of Abraham. But I want you to know the mercy actually goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden, Genesis 3:15. This promise that there will be someday someone who will be born from Adam and Eve who will crush the serpent's head, right? We're familiar with this language. And he himself will be bitten on the heel in the process. But this is going to take care of the sin problem. All right. So Act 3. This is actually a huge act, right? This is why it's so difficult sometimes for us to summarize the Old Testament, because from Abraham all the way to the end of the Old Testament is one act. And it's really about God focusing on the line of Abraham, specifically Abraham, and then Isaac, and then Jacob, and then the nation of Israel. And we recognize that there's other siblings involved in there. We've got Ishmael and Edom. And they're important people, no doubt about that, but they're not the ones through whom God gave the promises. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, that's the promises, and then Israel. And God gives Israel a task to do. So in scene 1, we're going to break this down into 2 parts because it's so lengthy. Scene 1, God ends up choosing a people So God makes a covenant with Abraham. Think about this. God actually says, I'm going to enter into a contractual agreement with you, Abraham. Now, typically, when we think of contracts and covenant, both parties have responsibilities. But you'll remember Genesis 12 and Genesis 15. You'll remember that when Abraham, he receives these promises in chapter 12, that he will be the source point of blessing for the entire world. He will be blessed. He'll be a blessing. All the nations are going to be blessed through him. If people bless Abraham, then they get blessed. If they curse Abraham, then they get cursed, including his line. But then it's in Genesis 15 where we see that God enters into a covenant with Abraham. Abraham falls into a deep sleep, and you may remember the carcasses of the animal are there, and this fire pot, smoke and fire enter between the pieces because God is the one who's obligating himself to Abraham and his line to do this. So God makes a commitment to Abraham. He wants to bless the world like he had in the Garden of Eden. He's chosen Abraham to be the point person for that. God rescues Abraham's descendants from Egypt. I'm kind of fast-forwarding a bit to the future story. The descendants of Abraham end up going to Egypt to survive the plague. You remember Joseph is instrumental in that. Eventually, God comes to redeem them from captivity, and he brings them out through a bunch of amazing miracles, judgments on Egypt. He brings them to the Red Sea, parts the waters they go through. They come out of all of that as a nation. They are now Israel for the first time. And so God makes a covenant with Israel. Now, we usually summarize this as the law, and I'm doing that in the notes, but we need to understand this whole covenant idea is more than just a list of do's and don'ts. In fact, the very first time that love for God is mentioned in the Bible is in the Ten Commandments, Exodus 20, love the Lord your God, right? I mean, eventually it gets fleshed out in Deuteronomy 6, love the Lord your God with all your mind, heart, soul, and strength. But you're supposed to not worship other idols. You're supposed to love God, Yahweh. Israel is supposed to be focused on Yahweh. So love was the foundation of this relationship between Yahweh and his people. God gives Israel a mission. He tells them that they're to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. You can go back to Exodus 19. In other words, just like Adam and Eve had a function in the Garden of Eden, Israel has a function within God's plan to be a kingdom of priests. So just rewind a little bit and think about, what does a priest do? A priest represents God to the people and the people to God. So Israel as a nation was supposed to be representing the one true God to all the nations who are living according to a different story. And they're supposed to do that by being a holy nation, by being set apart for God. And therein lies the problem, right? They end up not being holy, and so they actually end up not fulfilling their primary function, which was to be a kingdom of priests. God ends up dwelling with his people, and he provides a way for them to be in his presence. So we have like a little miniature Garden of Eden going on with the tabernacle and the temple, ultimately the temple, right? Where God's presence is with his people, and they're living under the rules of the Garden of Eden, and now the tabernacle is very similar. God's presence is in the midst of his people now. It's not open-ended. They don't all get to go and be in the presence of God like the Holy of Holies. That's only the high priest, and he can only go in once a year, but it still is the presence of God in the midst of the people. And they're also given instructions on how to live, wisdom, how to make right decisions, how to know how to handle problems as they come up. And they're also given a promised land. Very much kind of a reboot of what God had wanted to do initially.